Welcome to AI and Machine Learning Deep Dives. I'm really excited about what we're going to unpack today because we're diving into a topic that is foundational, yet, well, often misunderstood in machine learning. Support vector machines, or SVMs, and the fascinating kernel trick.
It really is. It's a truly elegant concept. And what we want to do for you today is break down how SVMs work, especially, when data gets a bit messy, and reveal the clever solution that lets us tackle classification problems that might seem impossible at first glance. We'll explore why these methods are so powerful and where they're still applied in the real world today.
Okay, so let's start with the core idea. What are SVMs, fundamentally? Imagine you have a bunch of data points, right? And you want to separate them into two different categories, maybe blue dots and red squares, just to visualize it. And SVM's main goal, its primary objective, is to find the absolute best dividing line, or hyperplane, if we're talking more than two dimensions, the one that creates the largest possible gap or margin between these two groups.
Exactly. It's not just any line. It's the one that gives you the biggest buffer zone.
Right. The bigger the margin, the more confident we can be in our separation.
That's right. And initially, SVMs were designed for data that could be perfectly separated by a straight line. We call that linearly separable data. That's the classic hard margin SVM. Perfect separation, no mistakes allowed.
But, well, reality isn't usually that clean, is it? What happens when your data points are all mixed up and you just can't draw a single straight line to perfectly separate them?
Yeah, that's the much more common scenario.
So that's where it gets interesting. We have options. One is called a soft margin SVM. Instead of demanding that perfect separation, which might be impossible, we allow for, some mistakes, some misclassifications, or maybe some points creeping inside that margin.
It's a trade-off.
Exactly. It's about finding a balance. You want to maximize that margin still, but you also want to minimize those errors. And there's actually a parameter, often called C, that lets you control this trade-off. How much are you willing to penalize errors versus prioritizing a wider margin?
Precisely. This flexibility is what allows SVMs to work with real-world data, which is, let's face it, rarely perfectly clean. It makes them practical. And this really brings us to takeaway number one. Support vector machines aim to find the optimal hyperplane, not just to separate data, but to do so by maximizing the margin between classes. And crucially, they can adapt to nonlinearly separable data using the soft margin approach, which cleverly balances margin size against the number of misclassifications.
Okay, that makes sense. Soft margin gives it flexibility. Now, to understand how SVMs handle even more complex data, the really nonlinear stuff, we need to talk about something called the dual formulation. It sounds a bit math-heavy, maybe, and, well, it has its mathematical roots. But what's really fascinating is that there are two equivalent ways to write down the SVM optimization problem. There's the primal problem, that's basically what we just described, directly minimizing errors and maximizing margin. And then there's this dual problem.
Right. And in optimization theory, this primal dual relationship is, well, pretty fundamental. Solving one often gives you the solution to the other. Sometimes the dual is actually easier to solve. It might look totally different on the surface using a different set of variables, these Lagrange multipliers usually. But finding the solution to the dual problem, it actually gives you the answer to the original primal problem. And this alternative view, it has some really crucial benefits for SVMs.
Yeah, like how it highlights the support vectors, right? Remember we said the optimal line is determined by the points closest to it? Well, the dual formulation makes this explicit. You find that only these support vectors, the points right on the edge of the margin, or maybe even the ones slightly on the wrong side in the soft margin case, only they actually matter for defining that hyperplane.
Exactly. All the other data points, the ones far away from the boundary, they effectively get a zero weight in the dual solution. They have no influence on where the final line is drawn. It's quite remarkable.
It really is. And this focus on just the support vectors leads to another advantage.
It does, computationally. The dual formulation often becomes much cheaper to solve, especially when you're dealing with high-dimensional data. Think about data sets with, thousands or millions of features, but maybe fewer data points.
Okay.
Instead of working with the raw data directly, the dual formulation, it only needs the inner products between data points.
Inner products, like dot products, a measure of similarity.
Essentially, yes. A measure of similarity or relationship between pairs of data points. So if you have n data points and key features, the primal might involve key dimensions, but the dual, It mainly operates on an n by n matrix of these inner products. If your number of features p is way bigger than your number of samples n, calculating those n squared inner products can be much faster than working in p dimensions.
Right, that makes sense. So working with pairs of points instead of all the features directly.
And this reliance on inner products, well, that's the key. Why is that so important?
It sounds specific, but it's the gateway, isn't it, to the next big idea?
It absolutely is. It sets the stage perfectly.
Okay, so that brings us to takeaway number 2. The SVM optimization problem can be reformulated into an equivalent dual problem. This dual view is often more computationally efficient, especially for high-dimensional data, and crucially, it reveals that only the support vectors, the data points closest to the separating boundary, actually determine the final hyperplane. The rest of the data doesn't influence it directly.
Precisely. And that reliance on inner products is everything.
Which leads us straight into the kernel trick. This is maybe the most, well, magical part of SVMs for many people. Imagine that data we talked about earlier, the messy stuff. Maybe it's not just mixed up, maybe it's fundamentally nonlinear. Like you've got points forming a circle and points outside the circle.
Yeah, the classic example, a circle inside a square, maybe?
Right. You absolutely cannot draw a single straight line in 2D to separate those perfectly.
Impossible in the original space.
But what if we could somehow transform that data, lift it into a higher dimension, say map our 2D points into 3D space? Maybe in that 3D space, the circle points are down low and the square points are up high.
Then suddenly, they might become separable by just a flat plane, a linear separator in that higher dimension.
Exactly. That's the core idea. Project the data somewhere else where it is linearly separable.
But there's a catch. Explicitly calculating the coordinates of every point in some potentially very high dimensional space that can be computationally insane. Imagine squaring all your features or taking all pairwise products. The number of dimensions can just explode. You might run out of memory, or it could take forever to compute.
Right. The curse of dimensionality can bite hard there.
Yeah.
So here's where the trick comes in. The kernel function. It lets us get the result of doing an inner product in that high-dimensional space without ever actually going there.
That was a shortcut, a brilliant one.
We stay in our original lower-dimensional space. We take 2 points, plug them into the kernel function, and it spits out a number. And that number is exactly the same as if we had transformed both points into the high-dimensional space and then computed their inner product there.
It's like magic. You get all the power of the high-dimensional separation without the crippling cost of the high-dimensional calculation.
So the kernel function is basically computing similarity, but in a way that corresponds to that high-dimensional inner product.
Precisely. It's a function, kxy, that equals the dot product of fix and fakie, where phi is that mapping to the higher dimensional space.
Yeah.
But we never compute ficx or phi. We only compute kxy. Of course, not just any function can be a kernel. It needs to satisfy certain mathematical conditions, often related to Mercer's theorem, to guarantee that such a high-dimensional space implicitly exists. This ensures the math still works out and the optimization problem is solvable.
Okay. And there are common kernel functions people use.
Oh, yes. The polynomial kernel is one it implicitly considers interactions between features up to a certain degree. And probably the most popular is the radial basis function, or RBF kernel, sometimes called the Gaussian kernel.
Ah, yes, the RBF kernel.
It's incredibly powerful because it implicitly maps data into an infinite dimensional space that allows it to create really complex, wiggly decision boundaries if needed.
Wow. Infinite dimensions without infinite computation. That's the trick.
That's the essence of it. And that brings us neatly to takeaway number 3. The kernel trick allows SVMs to classify even highly non-linearly separable data. It works by implicitly mapping the data into a higher dimensional space where linear separation is feasible, but it cleverly avoids the huge computational cost of actually performing this mapping by only calculating kernel functions, which represent inner products, in the original lower dimensional space.
Okay, that's a really powerful concept.
Right.
So we've talked about the core idea, the dual problem, the kernel trick. Why should people really care about all this? Where does it make a difference?
Well, beyond the mathematical elegance, which is considerable, these techniques have had and continue to have a huge impact in practice. We see them used extensively in text classification, things like spam filtering, sentiment analysis, categorizing news articles. SVMs were state-of-the-art for a long time there.
Right, text data is often very high dimensional, so that dual formulation and kernel trick really help.
Exactly, and also in image classification, identifying objects, face detection, even medical image analysis. Character recognition, like reading handwritten digits or letters. They're also used in bioinformatics, classifying proteins, analyzing gene expression data, things like that. Really versatile.
It's interesting how they connect to broader machine learning principles, too.
Yeah.
You mentioned optimization earlier. SVMs fit into this idea of empirical risk minimization, right?
They do. The goal is generally to find a model that performs well on the training data you have, empirical risk, but also isn't overly complex, so it generalizes well.
And SVMs have a specific way of doing that.
Yes, they use a particular loss function called the hinge loss.
Hmm.
What's really neat about the hinge loss, especially in the separable case, is that minimizing it directly corresponds to finding the classifier with the maximum margin.
So the loss function itself is aiming for that maximum margin boundary.
Correct. It penalizes points that are on the wrong side of the margin. Points correctly classified and far away from the margin get zero loss. Points inside the margin or misclassified get a penalty that increases linearly as they get further on the wrong side.
So it inherently pushes towards that robust, large margin solution.
Exactly. Which theoretically helps prevent overfitting. It finds the simplest function, in a sense, the one with the max margin that separates the data. Of course, choosing the right kernel and tuning its parameters, often using cross-validation, is still vital for getting the best practical results.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And that leads us to takeaway number 4. SVMs, especially when empowered by the kernel trick, are incredibly effective tools used across diverse real-world applications like text, image, and biological data classification. Their power comes from a solid theoretical foundation, minimizing the specific hinge loss function, which directly encourages maximizing the geometric margin, leading to models that are often robust and generalize well to new data.
Well put. They have a strong theoretical backing for their practical success.
But like any tool, they're not perfect, right?
Mhm.
What are some of the limitations or, things to watch out for?
Absolutely. No silver bullets in machine learning. One key thing is that standard SVMs typically require fully labeled training data. Getting those labels can be expensive or time-consuming.
Right. Supervised learning.
Exactly. Another point is that the basic SVM output is just the classification which side of the hyperplane a point falls on. It doesn't directly give you probabilities like, I'm 80% sure this is class A.
Oh, okay. Some other models, like logistic regression, give probabilities directly.
Right. There are methods to calibrate SVM outputs to get probability-like scores, but it's an extra step, not native to the core algorithm.
And what about handling more than two classes? We've mostly talked about blue dots versus red squares.
Good point. Natively, SVM is a binary classifier, just two categories. But that's not a deal breaker for multi-class problems. There are standard strategies like one versus all or one versus rest. You train a separate binary SVM for each class, distinguishing it from all the other classes combined. Then you see which classifier is most confident, or
Yeah.
one versus one. You train a binary SVM for every pair of classes. Then you have a sort of tournament or voting system to decide the final class.
Gotcha. So you build multiple binary SVMs to handle the multi-class case.
Exactly. It works quite well in practice. And the field hasn't stood still either. There are important extensions. We have support vector regression, or SVR.
For predicting numbers instead of categories.
Precisely, adapting the margin idea to regression problems. There are also things like transductive SVMs, which try to leverage unlabeled data alongside labeled data during training. And structured SVMs for when your output isn't just a simple class label, but something more complex, like a sequence or a tree structure.
Wow, okay, so it's a pretty rich area.
It is. And even on the optimization front, methods like stochastic gradient descent, or specifically subgradient descent for the hinge loss, have made it feasible to train SVMs on very, very large data sets where the classic quadratic programming solvers might struggle.
So they continue to be relevant even in the age of, say, deep learning for certain tasks.
Definitely. Especially for smaller to medium-sized data sets, high-dimensional data, or where interpretability of support vectors is useful, they're a key part of the machine learning toolkit.
Right. Which I think brings us to our final takeaway. Let me try to summarize this one. Takeaway number 5. While SVMs traditionally need fully labeled data, are fundamentally binary classifiers and sometimes have parameters like the kernel choice that can be tricky to interpret, they've been successfully extended. They can handle multi-class problems using techniques like 1vs-all. They can perform regression, SVR, and modern optimization methods allow them to scale to larger data sets, ensuring their continued relevance.
That's a great summary. Captures the nuance as well.
Okay, fantastic. That was a really insightful tour through SVMs and the kernel trick. Let's quickly recap the key insights, those 5 takeaways we nailed down.
That's so good. So first, takeaway number 1. Support vector machines aim for the optimal separating hyperplane by maximizing the margin between classes, and the soft margin approach gives them the flexibility to handle real-world, non-perfectly separable data by balancing margin size and errors.
Right. Then takeaway number 2. The SVM problem has an equivalent dual formulation, often better for high-dimensional data, which crucially shows that only the support vectors near the boundary define the hyperplane.
Then takeaway number 3. The amazing kernel trick lets SVMs handle nonlinear data by implicitly mapping to a higher dimension via kernel functions, calculating inner products there without the computational cost of the explicit mapping.
Next up, takeaway number 4. Powered by kernels, SVMs are effective in many applications, text, images, biology, because they minimize hinge loss and maximize margin, leading to robust and generalizable models.
And finally, takeaway number 5. Although they have requirements like labeled data and are binary by nature, SVMs have been broadly extended for multi-class tasks, regression, SVR, and large-scale optimization, keeping them highly adaptable.
Excellent. That covers the core concepts really well. Thinking about that kernel trick again,
Yeah.
mapping implicitly to potentially infinite dimensions,
Yeah.
it makes me wonder, is there truly such a thing as fundamentally unseparable data if you can keep mapping higher and higher? Or can the right kernel, in theory, always find some abstract space where even the most tangled data becomes linearly separable?
That's a deep question. The power of kernels is immense, but whether any dataset is separable depends on the nature of the data and the richness of the function class the kernel represents. Definitely something to ponder.
Indeed. Food for thought. That's all for now, folks. Please like, share, and subscribe for more like this.